When a film is considered a bona fide classic by so many other people, it's hard to go against the grain. If you're someone my age, but you don't care for Ghostbusters, The Princess Bride, or The Lord of the Rings, you're often treated with a little disdain. If you're a film critic and don't like Annie Hall, Ben-Hur, or The Godfather, I imagine you might have had a few tense moments when talking about those films with other critics. So what do you do if you like a particular film, but not as much as everyone else does? That's the case with me and Goldfinger. I have a great time while watching it, it's in my top 10 Bond films of all time, and I understand the love. However, it's never been the pinnacle of my preferences in Bond films, and that's a strange camp to be a part of. I agree with most of the positives given out. Most of the cast are peak examples of their respective categories. Connery gives his best performance of the series, it contains the best villain plot, and it's one of the most fun outings. It just so happens I have several films that I like more. And yet, I feel like I'm committing a crime when I admit that and don't place Goldfinger at the top of everything Bond related. Regardless of how I ultimately land on this film, it will continue to be a timeless juggernaut of pop culture, and deservedly so. It ushered in the Bond mania of the 60s, and to this day, there are only a couple of Bond films which the majority of the public would say is close to its level of quality. I mentioned in my last review that From Russia with Love was the favorite of many Bond alumni. Well, if there was someone prominent to the franchise that I didn't name there, then that's because their favorite film is most likely Goldfinger. Fans of this one are quite passionate in their adoration, and they're not wrong to be so praiseworthy. I write all of that to say this. I have a few personal nitpicks with it that hold it back from being in my top 5 of the series, but that doesn't mean that I don't love the film as well. Now, just because these are things that bother me, I don't want anyone to take my opinions too personally or to feel like these should bother them too. If you're still adamant that this is the best of the lot, that's fine. You're in good company. However, I would ask, would you mind making a little room for the rest of us in the fandom that just happen to like some of the other films more? Now let's get on with the story. After a mission in an undisclosed Latin America country, James Bond is relaxing in Miami when his old pal Felix Leiter comes to him with an assignment from M. Bond is to observe a man of interest named Auric Goldfinger, who is a legitimate bullion dealer and jeweler. Bond catches Goldfinger cheating at a card game and foils his scheme using his lady friend Jill Masterson. Goldfinger retaliates by having his henchman Oddjob knock Bond out and kill Jill by painting her head to toe in gold paint. When Bond returns to England, he demands an explanation from M as to what this is all about. Goldfinger is suspected to be engaging in some smuggling, and the government can't figure out how he's doing it. Bond shadows the man, first to a golf course, and then to his factory in Switzerland. As Bond observes Goldfinger at the factory, he overhears mention of something that seems to overshadow the smuggling called Operation Grand Slam. Bond now has to figure out what Grand Slam is and how to stop it without getting killed in the process. Goldfinger is a fairly straight-down-the-line adventure film. It's incredibly tight in its pacing, sharp in its dialogue, marvelous in its performances almost across the board, and spectacular in its imagination. One example of that is Operation Grand Slam. It's an ingenious villain scheme that improves on the source material. In the novel, Goldfinger simply intended to rob Fort Knox. In the film, Bond calls out some of the real-life problems Goldfinger would face if that's his intention, and he simply responds, "Who mentioned anything about removing it?" Bond puts the pieces together to figure out that Goldfinger intends to blow up Fort Knox with a nuclear device so that whatever gold is left is irradiated for 58 years. Now, it ultimately accomplishes the same end goal as the book. Goldfinger gets richer as a result, and thus this is one of the films I point to when people try to argue that the book is always better than the movie. On my most recent viewing, which was done immediately prior to writing this review, I noticed a thematic idea that permeates this film that I never noticed before. James Bond has many skills and traits that are assets to him in the series, but this film displays one of them in a way that no other film does: his intelligence. Bond never actually defeats Goldfinger in the most permanent way, he just outwits him every time. He uses Jill to put an end to his cheating at cards. He uses a decoy ball to beat him at his own game. He plays on Goldfinger's sense of caution to get out of the laser trap, and he charms Pussy Galore into switching sides at the end. In fact, it's only due to his own carelessness that Goldfinger is killed at the end. Whenever Bond tries to brute force his way around Goldfinger or use one of his gadgets, it fails. He wrecks the Aston Martin at the factory, he fails to get the CIA's help with his homing gadget, he gets his butt handed to him by Oddjob at Fort Knox, and he might have gotten himself blown up if he tried tearing out the wires in the bomb. This idea helps to keep Bond feeling grounded and believable. Too often in the series, the get-out-of-jail-free card can feel too easy and cheap. I'm not going to name any specifics because it's always a case-by-case basis with the films rather than a universal issue. But when you combine all of them together in the series, you get the impression that Bond has a gadget for almost every situation, or can fight his way out. And thus any suspense may get lost because the audience is a step ahead of the film in knowing how the hero's going to get out of the situation. I think Guy Hamilton was smart in emphasizing Bond's intelligence for this outing. This is doubly fascinating for me to discover this time out, because I've often heard Goldfinger get singled out as the film where Bond starts to overly rely on technology. I think you'll find as you go through the film that Bond's tech actually fails to get him out of a situation more often than not. Sean Connery has been magnificent in the past two films, but this outing is something else entirely. With each successive entry, Connery seems to be moving further and further away from Fleming's original creation. I think anyone would be hard-pressed to say that Goldfinger is Connery's most Fleming-like effort, and yet most of those same people would say that this is his best performance, and I would be in that same camp. He leans more into his natural charisma rather than playing Bond as Fleming wrote it, and I'm weirdly okay with that despite my general preference for the films that lean closer into Fleming's own sensibilities. He's so comfortable in this role now that he hardly misses a beat, and no other actor could command this film like he does. He's the definition of debonair here. It's one of the towering performances in this series, and while I still prefer some of the other actors as Bond, this performance is just hard to beat. I also want to take a moment to discuss something that I don't think I ever really picked up on until marathoning this series, and that's Bond's attitude towards death. Usually Bond isn't glib about death when it comes to his friends and allies. He seems to have a solemn respect towards the death of people like Karen Bay, Paula, Aki, and Tilly. It kind of reminds me of that moment in Assassin's Creed 2 where Ezio is admonished by his uncle to treat death with some dignity. I love how Connery will take a moment to mourn the dead, and that helps to remind the audience that Bond's job often involves the highest of stakes. Pretty much all of the succeeding actors have scenes where they take a moment over the corpse of a friend or loved one to give them a last goodbye, and I think we can credit Connery for introducing that character trait. I've done several ranking lists so far for various categories of the series, and with each of the character-based ones, Goldfinger's cast tends to be towards the top. Gert Frobe is my favorite villain of the series, and that's thanks both to the physical performance and Michael Collins' vocal dubbing. They blend together so well that I still get comments to this day from people who don't even realize that that actually isn't the man's voice. My top 3 favorite moments with him are the laser scene, the scene with him and Bond on the porch that I discussed earlier, and the little exchange that they have next to his Rolls Royce. He mixes both charm and menace in equal measure, and I feel like he's never overshadowed by Connery. It's such a great pairing, and it needed to be. Screenwriter Richard Maybaum describes this film as a duel, and a duel is only as interesting as its combatants. This film presents us both with one of the best Bond performances, and also, for my money, the best villain, and it's thrilling to watch them face off against each other. Maybe it's just me, but I never quite picked up on the tension in the golf scene until I was older. It's pretty clear from the beginning that Goldfinger knows who Bond is still playing plausible deniability, and yet Goldfinger is only humoring Bond so long as he personally has something to gain from it. Sure, Oddjob's hat at the end is a bit over the top, but in the moment, I'm not thinking about it because the performances are sucking me into the drama of the situation. Harold Sakata makes for one of the best henchmen as well. Because his acting is all physical, there's no question from the start that Bond will have a tough time defeating him, and I love that the final scene with him circumvents our expectations. Bond can't beat him with physical might. He gets thrown around like it's nothing, and his best hits do nothing to Oddjob. It's only when using an electrical current that Bond can defeat him. That fight, by the way, plays out in an almost acoustic silence, and it's kinda chilling. Pussy Galore is the best Bond woman of the Connery era. While Connery's Bond has more meaningful relationships with some of the others, no one pairs with him quite like Honor Blackman. Their dynamic is so fun, and I just eat up every scene with them. I don't think they actually fall for each other really on a deep emotional level, but it's a solar flare of chemistry that's hard not to enjoy. Now, there's just one thing I wish they had done differently with these two. I've talked about this in several other videos, and I think this is the biggest misstep the film makes. If you know what I'm talking about and you don't really want to hear a better explanation as to why this bit bothers me, feel free to skip ahead. I won't hold it against you. Several people still express disappointment bordering on rage that I have a problem with the barn scene with Connery and Blackman. Before I explain my issue, let me just say that everything about this scene besides the final shot works for me. This is their best scene together. It's a crucial moment in the story of the film, and I love them throwing each other around in the hay using judo. This scene is meant to illustrate Bond using his charms to win over Galore since his attempt to contact the CIA failed. And given that Bond using his wits is a major theme of the film, it makes perfect sense to me. However, that last shot of Bond pushing himself down on her makes it look too much like a man forces himself upon a woman, and it makes me extremely uncomfortable. I get that this is not what the filmmakers are going for. This is meant to be a fantasy where the hero can seduce any woman with his animal-like charm, and there's definitely some wish fulfillment going on here. Heck, I can even buy that Galore dresses up this way intentionally to be provocative, so there is some initial consent. But the way in which she is trying to get out from under him makes me momentarily wonder if she is resisting him in a way that signifies she is withdrawing that consent. It's just that single shot that ruins it for me. I think the solution to this is very simple. Change the final shot. Now here's my idea. Instead of having Bond force himself down on her, maybe have her in his arms and have her hesitate before going in for a kiss. That hesitation would still be vague enough to keep the suspense of whether she has switched sides or if she is just compelled by him to have sex. That way you still get the rest of the scene as is, Bond still shows that magnetic charm that compels her, and the final shot wouldn't be undermining the idea that Bond wins through his intelligence and wit. Now that's just my suggestion, and there are undoubtedly others. Now that I've gotten off my soapbox, let's continue. Ken Adam is my favorite production designer of these films. While his vision may have been horribly expensive, I think it was worth that expense if only for the imagination. The Fort Knox set in particular is astounding. I'm not sure if this is my favorite film design-wise, but it's certainly up there. This is also one of my favorites in the series sound design-wise. Now, when I talk about sound design, I don't necessarily mean music, although music is part of that package. Norman Winstall uses exaggerated sound effects throughout the film. They're not cartoony, but they're very overpronounced, and that helps to heighten the reality of the film. I think the mandate for this outing was entertainment at the expense of realism, and thus the choice of the sound effects here is in perfect marriage with the director's vision. No wonder Winstall was the first to win an Oscar for this series. I also cannot pass up the opportunity to talk about Q here. Desmond Llewellyn returns from the previous film and cements himself as the best Q of the series. His performance in From Russia with Love was mostly the same as Peter Burton's in Dr. No, but I liked the choice of Desmond there due to his face being a bit more animated than Peter's. Thankfully, the character of Q comes alive in this installment, and that's thanks to Hamilton's direction to Llewellyn. By making Q annoyed with Bond and his disrespect for the gadgets, it makes these scenes pull double duty. They provide the necessary info dumps about Bond's toolset, and they continue this idea of having fun. Without this direction, I doubt most people would cite the gadget showcases as highlights of the series. I think alongside License to Kill, GoldenEye, and The World Is Not Enough, this film contains some of my favorite bits of Q. And now, the Aston Martin DB5. This just might be the sexiest inanimate object I have ever seen. How can anyone watch this film and not want to own one of these? A great-looking sports car with fun gadgets like an ejector seat, revolving license plates, rear bulletproof screen, oil slick, machine guns, and tire-slashing spikes? Yes, please. Sure, other vehicles like the mini incarnations of the Batmobile, the DeLorean, and Kit from Knight Rider might have their fans, but the Bond cars are my pick for the best vehicles in film and television. At some point, I'm sure I'll get around to doing a ranking of all the Bond cars in the series, but expect the DB5 to be in the top 3, if not at the very top of that list. It's such a brand unto itself and an icon that it cemented itself as Bond's personal car. Every time it comes back, I get excited, though that's not as often as a casual fan might think. In fact, it wouldn't be until No Time to Die that we got a full-blown gadget-laden chase with the DB5 again. I don't own a lot of memorabilia of Bond, but one of the few things I own is a die-cast of the DB5, and alongside my Walther PPK, it's my favorite piece of Bond memorabilia that I own. John Barry's music is really good, with my favorite piece being the laser scene. However, I've never personally placed the whole effort above many of the other scores in the series. It's not that it does anything particularly wrong, it's just never been amongst my favorites. Part of that could be that I don't care for the mixing of the orchestra. It could be the screeching brass, or it could be something else entirely. I'm not even entirely sure that I could effectively defend my choice in a debate scenario. The best analogy I can think of to explain my feelings is to equate the score with something like garlic parmesan chicken wings. Those are really good, and I'll usually eat them if offered, but when I'm ordering something for myself, I'll go for something like barbecue or teriyaki wings. Same thing here with Goldfinger. When I go for a John Barry score, I'd rather go for The Living Daylights, or From Rush with Love, or On Her Majesty's Secret Service, or heck, even Octopussy. But Goldfinger is a perfectly fine score. I don't have too many criticisms about it. It's just never been a favorite. Let's move on to a few more of the criticisms I have. The editing for this film is a real mixed bag. It's not the pacing I take issue with, it's just certain sequences. Sections like the laser sequence, the chase at Auric Enterprises, and the golf game are standouts, but there are other moments like the pre-title sequence and the raid at Fort Knox that feel a bit off to me. For example, in the pre-title sequence, Bond shoots a rope over a wall, we see a guard react to it, and then Bond is suddenly down upon the guy and kicks him in the face. If you think about the geography of the sequence and the timing it would take for some guy to climb over the wall, how is Bond able to do that and land on top of the guy without the guard reacting to Bond climbing over the top of the wall? Another example is Fort Knox. There's a bit towards the end with Leiter and the other agents coming down the stairs. We have a close-up on Bond's face and can see some guys run towards the stairwell behind him, which I feel like I could identify one of them as being Leiter. Then we'll see Leiter with the same guys entering the vault a little later. All the while, the bomb is counting down the seconds and will eventually stop at 7. Haha, very clever. As I'm trying to play this out in my head, while thinking back to how long it took Oddjob to get down those same stairs, I'm just not seeing how the guy that switches off the bomb could get down there that fast. Also, am I the only one that feels like the air raid and seeing the trucks drive through a desolated Fort Knox takes a bit too long? I like most of the locations, but I have mixed feelings about Kentucky. I get that the film needs to be there given that Fort Knox is actually located there, but it just doesn't have the same appeal for me as going to places like Switzerland or England. I've said before that I'm generally not a fan of putting Bond in America. There are definitely some films that make a good case for it, like Live and Let Die and Diamonds Are Forever. However, I generally like my Bond traveling to someplace more upper class and exotic, like Paris or Tokyo or Cairo or Venice. Kentucky just feels a little out of place with that lineup. I don't know, maybe I'm making too big of a deal about it. I also think the character of Tilly Masterson does not fit very naturally into this story. As far as I can tell, she is here for two reasons. The first is to ensure that Bond gets captured at Auric Enterprises, and the second is to have another hot girl in the movie. She doesn't really contribute to the story beyond her interferences, which lead to an action scene. Several Bond pictures have a problem with superfluous side Bond girls, but I think the Connery era may have some of the worst offenders. When writing You Only Live Twice, screenwriter Roald Dahl talked about how the producers like to have 3 Bond women per picture as a somewhat arbitrary formula, and I think that idea may have gotten started with this film. Goldfinger set forth the standard in the public's mind for the rest of the series to reach. Connery became a megastar, and spy mania really took hold. In 1966 alone, there were over 20 different films inspired by the Bond series. But the legacy of the film isn't just limited to the 1960s. Oh no. In 2001, the American Film Institute included Goldfinger in its top 100 most exciting movies of all time, which was the only Bond film to be honored with that distinction. In 1999, the film was given a similar honor by the British Film Institute, though Dr. No was also included on that list. Even today, Goldfinger consecutively tops more fan ranking lists of the series than any other single entry. Suffice it to say, Dr. No and From Russia with Love had been laying the foundation for a phenomenon, and Goldfinger hugely benefited from that buildup, and not only lived up to it, but surpassed expectations for most audiences. There's a bit of a debate in film circles about which film constitutes the first true blockbuster. Most would cite the original Jaws, but I would argue that there were precedents even before that, and Goldfinger is one of those. As for me, I think this film is terrific. It's never been my favorite of the series, nor is it even my favorite Connery outing, but it's a film that I respect and enjoy rewatching. In fact, the 2 most recent viewings I did for the purposes of this review were the most I ever enjoyed the film. Yet, no Bond film is perfect, and I have just a few things that I don't care for here. But I would completely understand if someone chose this hill to die on. I much prefer the tone of something like From Russia with Love or For Your Eyes Only, the character depth of something like Casino Royale 2006 or On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and the thrills of something like GoldenEye or License to Kill. Yet for pure escapist entertainment, there are few Bond films that hold a candle to Goldfinger, and that's something I could use every so often in my palette. Sean Connery was on a winning streak with his films, and each one seemed to do better than the last. But how long could that success hold out?